Today I'm going to show you my technique for applying polyurethane, and that is wiping it on. And we're going to show you how to get amazing results with that technique. So there's many different ways to apply polyurethane. You have normal brush, you can spray it, and you can wipe it on. Each of those methods has their pros and cons, and we'll go over those few here real quickly. Spraying requires obviously spraying equipment. If you're not finishing projects regularly, you might not want to invest in a sprayer. That involves a little more cleanup, and you got to have a place to spray the project. But spraying, if you can get it set up right, leaves a beautiful finish, and you could probably get away with 3 sprayed on coats. That could be done within probably 2 days. The second way to do it is the traditional brush method. This method, you have to somewhat know how to use a paintbrush. Using a paintbrush isn't just as simple as, there's technique to it, and how you need to hold the paintbrush, when you need to go over areas again, when to know not to. It takes time to get good with a paintbrush, at least in my experience. The pros with using a brush is you generally can put on thicker coats. Some projects you could probably get away with 2 coats, but you probably want to end up doing 3 just to be safe. So you can buy wipe-on polyurethane that's specifically for wiping it on, or you can make it yourself, and all that is just taking normal polyurethane and thinning it down. I find this method to be a lot cheaper, and I can kind of control more the amount of thinning that I want the polyurethane to have, depending on the project that I'm doing. The project I'm finishing here is a tabletop that I stained, and if you want to see the video of how to make that tabletop, I have a video on that here, and we'll get to the pros and cons of wiping on polyurethane a little further on into the video. So I've waited about 2 days, probably around 80 hours for the stain to dry, and I think that's plenty of time, and I think a 50-50 mixture would be okay, but sometimes the more mineral spirits you add, some stains, it just will pull it off of the wood, so that's just something to be mindful of. But I think a 2-part polyurethane, 1-part mineral spirits works for me. So the way I go about this is I mix everything in a cup, but before you do that, you want to make sure to mix this up very well, especially your satin and your mats. They have things in here that make the finish less glossy, so if you don't mix those in and get them into this cup, they're not going to be in your finish, and you might get a finish with a lot of blemishes in it, so you want to make sure to mix this polyurethane up very well before you put it in here. Now I take a Sharpie, mark on the cup where I went to. We'll dump this in. I'll do 1 more of these. And we'll take the mineral spirits and fill it up to that line once, and that'll give us 2 parts polyurethane, 1 part mineral spirits. You can kind of play around with these mixtures to find what works best for you, but I think this 2-to-1 ratio, I think, for me is the best. Now we're going to mix this up. You definitely don't want to shake this up, you want to stir it, because you don't want to introduce air into this mixture. Usually the first coat I'll wait, and then overnight to do another coat in the morning, and 1 at night, 1 in the morning, 1 at night. Usually is what you can get away with. You probably could get this to 3 coats a day if you really wanted to push it, but I'm not really constrained for time so much on this project, so I'll just stick to 2 a day. Now that we've got that mixed up nicely, we're going to head over to the table. Alright, so we're just going to dip it in and start wiping. You really just want to make sure you coat the surface evenly. Make sure you don't leave any dry spots. And as you wipe, you may want to kind of wipe over the area if you see kind of any streaks left from your rag. But other than that, you really don't want to keep going over the same surface. So all you want to do is work from one edge of the table to the next, wiping with the grain, and try and go the full length of the table if you can. I was having a little trouble here because I had some wood on the other side, so I kind of worked halfway through the table, came back, did the other half, and then when I could work the full length down the table, I did. Just kind of minimizes any streaking that might occur if you wipe it the full length of the table. And so now I want to talk about the pros and cons of wiping on your finish. Now, one of the biggest pros is this method is super easy. It's very beginner friendly, and I would recommend it to really anybody. I switched from brushing because this method is just easier, honestly. The one major con to this is probably that you have to do more coats than you would brushing to get the same amount of coverage and protection. But there's also a trade-off there in the pro category is that you're putting on thinner coats, so often you can get 2 to 3 coats on in one day. So it's kind of equivalent to doing one heavy brush coat a day, except you're just doing multiple thinner coats. Now, because you're doing thinner coats, especially in your first coats, you have to be careful with sanding, and I'll kind of go over that here now. But you definitely want to be more cautious with these thinner coats, not to just completely sand off what you just put on. So I've went ahead and put a second coat on, and this is just because you don't really want to sand on your first coat because you don't want to risk burning through and sanding off your stain. So I do 2 coats. I'm going to come back with some 320 grit sandpaper on the back of a sanding sponge, just wrapping it around and holding it, getting any dust bumps off of the surface, making it nice and smooth. Then we're going to apply our third coat, and so we're probably going to do about 5 coats. And on a tabletop or anything, you want to finish both sides of the project. So as I'm going here, I'm finishing the front and back sides of this. I haven't really shown finishing the bottom because the bottom as well, you know, the bottom, same as the top, just looks less pretty. So we're going to keep working on this here. And when you're sanding, really, you don't want to be applying any pressure. Really no pressure at all. Work your way down. And you could feel if you've missed anything. But you want to keep the sanding light as you can. You don't want to sand too much. Sand what you need to and move on to the next area. You want to make sure to wipe your sandpaper off. And you also want to kind of wipe off, if you're going to go back over an area, kind of wipe some of that dust off because you don't want that building up on the sandpaper and causing scratches. So there's still some in this area. So I'm going to wipe it off, make sure my paper is wiped off, and hit it again. So just another word of caution regarding sanding again, especially when you're sanding the edges of your project. If you have a round over or any sort of details, you want to be especially careful if you are working with stain, not to burn through that finish, and even worse, sand through your stain. After you're sanding, I'm going to just take a tack cloth, not rubbing it in, but just getting all the dust out. Especially in the oak here, you can see it's kind of getting into the grain, so you want to be sure to get all of that out before you go and apply your next coat. With the tack cloth, you don't want to be rubbing it in because it's going to leave a residue. You just want to lightly brush it across the surface. So what I'm doing here is, because this project had a C channel in it, I've removed that and I'm just putting one thick, heavy, unthinned coat in that area. Alright, now that we've got a coat on the back, I got these 2 boards here with some screws in it. We're going to flip this over, then set these under it. That way our table won't get stuck to the sawhorses. It'll just be on these 4 little points. Boom! I need no help from nobody. So here I'm putting on the 4th coat. I'm going to do 5 coats in total, both sides, for this project. I think that's good enough for a table. Any other projects where there's going to be less wear and tear on them, such as like a face frame on a cabinet, you could do 3 to 4 coats and get away with that just fine. And like I've been saying, you could get up to 3 coats on in a day. I usually do 2, one earlier in the day and one later in the evening. But if I really needed to, I could stretch that to 1 first thing in the morning, 1 afternoon time, and then 1 in the evening, and really finish an entire tabletop in just 2 days. So you can really get the same amount of finish on as you could a brush in the same amount of time. It'll just take more work of actually applying those coats. So we are now about to put on the final coat, and as I progress to the coats 4 and 5, I'll try and do a little lighter of a coat, just so I don't risk any air bubbles or anything like that coming up. So I want to keep the coats as light as possible, but not too light to where it's literally drying as you are working in the same areas. Especially on a large surface like this, it's definitely a balance you want to find. But yeah, we're doing 5 coats here. This is the 5th and final coat. The 4th coat, there really wasn't much to sand off, so we just hit it with a Scotch-Brite pad. So these are these gray Scotch-Brite pads. This is, I think, the ultra fine pad. Just kind of going over it, making sure there aren't any dust nibs or anything like that. Wiping it down with the tack cloth, and then again with our hands just to make sure we got all the dust off. And now we're going to put on the final coat. So let's get to it. And here is the final product. I think it turned out pretty darn good. And so yeah, that's wiping on polyurethane for you. It's super easy to do. I highly recommend it if you haven't tried it. And if you learned anything from this video, if it helped you out, leave a like and subscribe. Helps out the channel a ton. And yeah, we'll see you guys in the next video. Have a wonderful week.